السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. حياكم الله جميعا. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. أما بعد. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما إلى علمنا. اللهم آمين. Researching the أشراط الساعة, علامات الساعة, the signs of the Day of Judgment, is always interesting, and every time I look into it, I always find things that I haven't seen before. SubhanAllah, and that's one of the things that motivate me to make this presentation, inshallah ta'ala. Although today, inshallah, the goal is to finish up with a lot of the major distinct signs that have already happened. And then next week we'll talk about some of the different signs of the Day of Resurrection. We talked about signs being of different categories, some of which are political events, and some of which are, for example, social trends. And when you read through the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ about signs of the Day of Resurrection, you're going to find that the vast majority of those described are social trends, for example, and things that that you see in society, that trends that you see among the Muslims, and things that were in the way that the Prophet ﷺ describes it. A lot of times he would describe simply seeing a person. For example, just one example that of the signs of the Day of Resurrection is that a person would walk by a gravestone or a headstone and by a grave and said, Ya laytani makanak, I wish that I was in your place. I wish that I was in your place, meaning I wish I was dead. I wish I was not living in this world right here with all the, maybe it's because of fitna and tribulation in the world and tremendous uncertainty of the world, or it could be because of their despair of life and great tremendous depression and heart angst that they're feeling. However, there's no doubt that even at the time of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, when he said those words, when there were tens of millions of people on earth, probably it would not be surprising if there were some people that exactly walked by a gravestone and said those exact same words. However, when he describes seeing someone like this or seeing someone like that, or that this is from the signs of the hour, he's referring to that being a trend that's is much more common than just afrada, than just an individual here or there, but something that's far more common in the world. And as for where to find these ahadith, where to find these narrations, because in the Quran there's very little in the Quran about signs of the Day of Resurrection. The Quran is mostly about the Day of Resurrection and also about the past prophets. But there's a little bit of mention here and there about some signs, but the majority, the vast majority, 99% of what we learn about the signs of the resurrection come from the hadith of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. And if we look in a book of fiqh, a book of hadith, for example, Sahih Muslim, for example, or Sunan Abu Dawood, or any of these books of hadith, if you want to just simply to skim through these chapters to see what they say, you would look under Kitabul Fitan. It's called Kitabul Fitan, or the Book of Trials and Tribulations, from the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. And those books always start out by mentioning first about fitna, and the fitna that the general ahadith about fitna that would come to the Muslims in general, and then after that describing some of the fitna of after the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and then ashratu sa'a, and then the final things that would happen before the Day of Resurrection. So last time after a bit of introduction, we talked about the message of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ being among the signs of the Day of Resurrection, and how this was something that was felt the world over in a lot of different ways. For example, أغلقت السماء, the heavens were closed, and even the jinn, they realized that something major was happening once the Quran started being revealed to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Bi'athat an-Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and Herald, the emperor of Rome, was given signs and alluded to a new prophet coming. And this was something that, among many different groups, there were signs in their literature of something major happening at that time. And then, of course, we mentioned the death of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and then after that, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, among the signs of the day of resurrection are Fathul Bayt al-Maqdis, the conquest of Jerusalem, Bayt al-Maqdis, or Quds. And then going on after that, as far as political signs and things that have definitely happened for certain, and one of the most amazing things that happened is that, like right here, what we see is a map of the Persian Empire. Now, the Persian Empire went through many different phases, perhaps after revolutions or religion changes or different things here and there, and changes of who the royal family is, or whatever the case may be. But the last phase was known as the Sasanian Empire, and at their greatest extent was under the Emperor Khusra, and that is he's mentioned. The Emperor Khusra is mentioned in several ahadith of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, because this emperor was so famous. This was the Emperor Khusra, or Kisra, who defeated. He's the same one who defeated Heracles, the emperor of the Byzantine Empire. And when he defeated Heracles, he conquered all this land, Egypt and Levant and all of this area. And at that victory, that huge victory for the Persian Empire, it looked as if maybe the Persian Empire was almost invincible, and that they were going to take over the world and maybe even destroy the Byzantine Empire. And at that moment, that is when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed the ayah, غُلِبَتِ الرُّومُ فِي أَدْنَى الْأَرْضِ وَهُمْ مِنْ بَعْدِ غَلَبِهِمْ سَيَغْلِبُونَ فِي بِضْعِ سِنِينَ. That the Romans have been defeated in the lowest land by the Dead Sea, as that battle took place right around the Dead Sea, and that which is the lowest spot on earth, below sea level. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that the Romans, or the Byzantines, will be victorious in an odd number of years, or in a small number of years, within 10 years. So 3 to 10 years, 3 to 9 years. And so when that was revealed, of course, that was a big surprise, because the Quraysh, and anyone who was thinking, look at this, they just had a huge victory. Who's going to bet on the losers now? That's nuts. However, apart from that ayah in the Quran, that we know that story from the life of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, is that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he was saying from the very beginning of his risala, which is probably the most amazing prophecies, was that from the very, very beginning, he was telling people that Islam, that his ummah would conquer and destroy and vanquish the Persian Empire completely, not just defeat them in a battle, but completely destroy them and eliminate them from the earth. The Persian Empire, which had been around for 1,000 years, and was and currently at that time was under the rule of a very, very strong emperor, Kisra, here, and which is why when one man came to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam told him that he is going to wear the bangles of Kisra, The man said, Kisra ibn Hormuz. And the Prophet ﷺ said, yes, Kisra ibn Hormuz. That same one, wearing the bracelets of the Emperor of Persia. And in some narrations it mentions that, I think it was Abu Dhar, if I remember correctly, Abu Dhar, or I'm thinking someone else, who came to Mecca because they heard of a man claiming prophethood. And this was at the time when the Prophet ﷺ did not even have 10 followers yet. And when trying to find who this man was, he ran into Abbas ibn Abdul Muttalib. And Abbas said, this is my nephew, who claims that he and his wife and cousin Ali here, that they're going to take over the Persian Empire. And so even from that short time when the Prophet ﷺ just had less than 10 people, this was one of the very first prophecies that he ever made, and it was one that he reaffirmed over and over and over, and in many different terms. And now looking at this map here, just as a point of note, so here are some of the, so this is the Persian Empire at that time, and just some of the cities here. Ctesiphon right here is actually, in Arabic at that time, it was known as Madain, the city of Madain, and that was their capital. That was the capital, although it wasn't the biggest city, as you can see, but it was their capital. Another major city at that time was Hira. And for example, when the Prophet ﷺ was once talking to Adi ibn Hatim, I believe it was, he was sitting with the Prophet ﷺ, and one person came up to him and said, that they were robbed. And another person came up to the Prophet ﷺ and said that some things were stolen from them. Another person came to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and complained of this and that and the other. Different problems happening to them while they were traveling. And then the Prophet ﷺ looked at Adi and he said, have you been to the city of Hira? And Adi said, no, I haven't, but I've heard of it. And how beautiful and amazing it is, the great Persian city. And the Prophet ﷺ said that there will come a time, or you will see a time, when someone will be able to ride from Hira all the way to the Hijaz without fearing anyone but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that was also another way of foreseeing the conquest of the Persian Empire. And during we know that the Battle of the Khandaq, when the Prophet ﷺ and his companions, when they were digging the trench, and when they were about to be surrounded by 10,000 different pagans from 3 major Arab tribes, and then also several other small clans here and there, and also being betrayed from within by Banu Qurayza, when they were digging the trench, they came upon a huge boulder, and they couldn't break it apart. And then the Prophet ﷺ asked for an axe, and then he broke it, and then a big light was shined up and blinded everyone for a second. And then he brought the axe down again, Allahu Akbar, every time, and 3 times. And then he said afterwards, I have seen the palace of Hira, and I've seen the palace of and he mentioned different palaces, and mentioning the Persian Empire, and also in Bilad al-Sham and Yemen as well. And different narrations mention different palaces and places and locations, but what it comes down to is the Persian Empire, of course, and the Byzantines in Levant and Yemen. And that was at a time when Islam was about to be extinguished. So here the Prophet ﷺ, he's making these grandiose prophecies, these bold prophecies at times when it seems like Islam could be, all the Muslims, are about to be squashed, subhanAllah. But here, by the time that the Prophet ﷺ passed away, This and once the Romans reclaimed their land, this is what the Persian Empire was reduced to. So already there was some signs of weakness on their part. But the Byzantines, they would not have any plans to continue expanding. No, I mean, many people have tried to expand and destroy the Persian Empire before, of course, and no one ever finally completing it, not even Alexander the Great, because, of course, it gets reborn and stuff in different ways. But, however, they were allowed to, they continued their activities in different ways. And the one thing that's really interesting about the conquest of Persia during the time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and of course here's a picture of Hira itself, is the diqqah that he had in describing the conquest of Persia by Islam. On one hand, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when he sent letters to the different emperors and the different kings and chiefs of his time, many of them, they read those letters, and some of them, they accepted Islam, they accepted the message. And of the Byzantines, of course, we know the famous story of when Heracles summoned, when he captured an Arab caravan, and Abu Sufyan was their leader, and he interrogated or asked Abu Sufyan a few questions, and Heracles became convinced of the prophethood of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. However, his own pride and fear prevented him from accepting Islam. However, he preserved and respected the message, the risala that was sent to him from the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. However, when the letter was sent to the Emperor of Persia, and when the Emperor of Persia saw that letter, he laughed and ripped it up into pieces. And when the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam received that message back, he said that Heracles preserved his letter, so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would preserve his kingdom for a time, and that Kisra destroyed the letter, so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would destroy his kingdom. And complete yumazziqahu kulla mumazzaq, and tamziq muqihim, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would completely and utterly destroy the Persian Empire. And that, of course, came on the hands of the Muslims during the Khilafah it began during the Khilafah of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, when he sent Khalid ibn Walid, and who had about 100 victories in a row against the Persians. And then, of course, Umar ibn al-Khattab had the greatest victories against the Persians, with when Umar, he did not use Khalid ibn Walid as a commander, but instead used other commanders like Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, Nu'man ibn Muqarrin, and Abu Ubaidah, among others, for the larger victories. And then, of course, the last emperor, Yazdegerd III, died during the Khilafah of Uthman ibn Affan, radiyallahu anhu. And one thing also about the prophecy of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was, as one time when the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was with his companions and reciting Quran to them, and he recited the verse, هو الذي بعث في الأميين رسولا منهم يتلو عليهم آياته ويزكيهم ويعلمهم الكتاب والحكمة وإن كانوا من قبل لفي ضلال مبين. He is the one who sent from among them a messenger from themselves. He recites his ayahs to them, purifying to them, and teaches them the book and the wisdom. And before that, they were in plain error. And then the next ayah, وَآخَرِينَ مِنْهُمْ لَمَّا يَلْحَقُوا بِهِمْ وَهُوَ الْعَزِيزُ الْحَكِيمُ. And others from among them who have not yet reached them, and he is the Aziz al-Hakim, he is the mighty and the wise. And so the companions asked, who does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mean by others who are like them, like the Sahaba, but have not yet reached them? And the Prophet ﷺ paused for a moment. Then he looked at Salman al-Farisi, Salman the Persian, and he said, لو كان الإيمان في الثريا لناله رجال من قوم هذا. If faith was tied to the Pleiades, a constellation in the sky, then men from this person's tribe would go to get it. They would go to find it. And subhanAllah, when it comes to the hadith of the Prophet Muhammad and the preservation of his deen, it was preserved almost exclusively, not going to say entirely or exclusively, but almost exclusively in the hands of Persians. Persians who became Muslims, and Persians, they started accepting Islam during the time of the Khilafah Rashida, of course. Of course, Salman al-Farisi was the very first during the Prophet's time, but then they trickled in, bit by bit by bit, and then eventually, large crowds of them, and then their children and their children's children began to. It used to be no. It eventually came to be that, for example, Arabic, the science of Arabic, was known as ilm al-mawali, the science or the knowledge of the slaves, because, or the freed slaves, the mawali, because they accepted Islam and they loved the religion that was brought to them from the Arab, and they started immersing themselves in it and trying to understand the Arabic language better, to teach it better and understand it better among each other. And so they were the ones who were truly instrumental in codifying the Arabic language and also searching for the hadith of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so, for example, many of the imams of Islam and most of the imams of hadith are of Persian descent, Persian background. There are some that are from Arab background, and there are also many who are of mixed or disputed heritage. Imam Bukhari, of course, is mostly Persian background, but Imam Abu Hanifa, rahimahullah ta'ala, is of disputed heritage. Some say he was Arab, some say he was Persian. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. And Imam Ahmed Arabi, and Imam Shafi'i Arabi, and Imam Malik, of course, was Yemeni, Asbahi. Of the purest of the Arab, of course. And then, from the other Imams, most of them, though, the vast majority were ultimately from Persian background. And so the Prophet ﷺ's prophecy of them, hirsuhum ala al-ilm, and their greed and attention for knowledge, is really a truly daqiq and minute prophecy that, subhanAllah, came true, that this deen of Islam was preserved by these people who were not even Arab. And so there's an interesting story, actually, that I think it was from Hisham ibn Abd al-Malik, the Khalifa, the Umayyad Khalifa, and that he met Muhammad ibn Shihab al-Zuhri one time, and Hisham ibn Abd al-Malik, he asked al-Zuhri, he said, how's Medina, where you came from, or I forget which place Muhammad ibn Shihab al-Zuhri lived in many different cities, but he asked and asked how he left the city, and what condition was the city when he left it, and who is leading the city, and how are they leading it. And he would mention names here and there, and Hisham would ask, who is this person that you mention as being the main leader, or the one with al-qawl al-munaffad, the one with the most influential voice in the city. And every single time Zuhri would say that they are a scholar of Islam, and every single time he would say that they are from the Mawali, from the freed slaves, and who are almost inevitably Persians. Some of them were Berber from North Africa, but most of them were Persians. And so Hisham ibn Abdul Malik, at the end of asking about all these different cities and getting the same response over and over and over, even different names, famous names, he said there's going to come a time when these mawali, when the slaves of the Ajam, the non-Arab, are going to be speaking to us from the manabir, from the pulpits, while we Arab are sitting down below. And that has, come true in so many ways, subhanallah, as even especially in the West, where the vast majority, or I shouldn't say the vast majority, but a great number of the khutaba, the khatibs and imams in various masajid are not from Arab background, and most of those that carry the da'wah are in fact from Pakistan and India, and especially in London and England, that's very, very prevalent. But there are lots of Arab imams in America, but there's also a great number from outside them, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala preserve all of them. Now, the conquest of Persia, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he mentioned that many times, and he also said, that one time he said, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Inna Allah zawali al-arda wa uritu ma zuwiya li minha. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala rolled up the earth for him, and he saw what was rolled up for him. Wa anna ummati tabluqu ma zuwiya li minha. Confusing the nas exactly, but however, he said that what means that my ummah, or that my ummah would stretch to as far as what was shown to me of. And what he used specifically, the exact words that he used, which are very prophetic and very daqiq and minute, were mashariq al-ardi wa magharibiha, the east and the west. He did not say the north and the south. The Prophet ﷺ did not say the north and the south. He said the east and the west. And look at how Islam has spread. It has spread to the east and then to the west, of course, but not so much north nor south. And subhanallah, so Islam is the major religion of the equatorial and temperate climates on earth, alhamdulillah. But and one of my favorite ahadith in all of Islam is that where the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, لَيَبْلُغَنَّ هَذَا الْأَمْرُ مَا بَلَغَ اللَّيْلُ وَالنَّهَارُ, that this affair will reach as far as the night and the day reach, and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not leave any house that's made of mud, or made of built of fur or leather, or whatever the case may be, except that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will bring Islam to that house with the bi'izya azizan, that where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give izzah to the one who clings to it and embraces it, and dhul, which is humility, to the ones who resist it and are simply following along and in spite of themselves. But just showing how much Islam would spread. And the Prophet ﷺ is, while we are 1.8 billion people today, alhamdulillah, mashallah, tabarakallah, but the Prophet ﷺ is making these prophecies, making these statements when the Muslims they don't even go beyond one single city on earth, subhanallah, which is just the most amazing thing. And you cannot see prophecies like that from anyone else that have come true so amazingly. Now, when it comes to more political events and incidents that happened in the life of the Prophet Muhammad, from afterwards, the Prophet ﷺ had said that the hour would not come until you fight a people, and he described their appearance. Their faces look like shields, and they have hair on their feet, or they wear hair over their feet. Their shoes are made of hair, and The Prophet ﷺ also said many times, "Utrukul atraka ma tarakatkum," or ma tarakukum. Leave the Turk alone, or the Atrak, the Turkic peoples, as long as they leave you alone. And in other narrations, he goes on to say, فإنما يسلبكم ما خولكم الله ما خولكم الله بنو قنطرة. I know I'm forgetting a word somewhere here, but basically meaning that because no one's going to take away what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is giving you except for, and I don't know where this come from, but this might have been a name that was known for them, or a long off progenitor of the Turkish peoples. But Banu Qantora, the Prophet ﷺ referred to them as. And when we think about this narration, utrukul atrak, leave alone the Turks, or the Atrak. Nowadays when we think about the Turks, what do we mean by, if we say that someone is Turkish, generally we assume that they live in Turkey, or that their parents are from Turkey. The actual, right here in the map, Anatolia, the Asian side of Turkey, or Istanbul, the Western European, the Western side, the European side of Turkey. And so, however, when the Prophet ﷺ says Turk, and when there's some confusion, for example, if someone's reading history and they're new to it, they're going to find a lot of different words that seem to be used almost in place of one another. However, it seems to be that there is discrepancy. For example, the word Tatar and the word Turk and the word Mongol and the word Mughal, like the Mughal Empire from India. So all these different words, they are similar and different, and they could technically mean or refer to the same thing depending on the context, which is what might bring some confusion for someone who's trying to read a history book, for example. And so when the Prophet ﷺ, and at his time, 1400 years ago, referring to the Turk, in this map right here, unfortunately, I don't know if I can move where my head is on this video. Let's see here. Oh, no, I don't think I can. Okay, at least not during the presentation itself. But hopefully you can see this map a little bit. So this area right here, this is where the Turkish peoples originated. And so this is, just almost touching Mongolia here, but mostly we see Central Asia, Northeast Iran, and all this area right here of Central Asia primarily. This is where, so all these people technically, although nowadays they might call themselves Uzbeki or Kazakh or use different names like that, because of the nationalistic identities that they've taken since then, and most recently especially. But historically, all these areas were referred to as Turkic peoples. And then of course they expanded over the time, and then eventually migrated in different places. And of course a lot of that migration was through war. And so the Prophet ﷺ, let's look at this prophecy. Leave the Turks alone as long as they leave you alone, because no one will take away what Allah has given you except for Banu Qantora, which is, probably referring to the Turks, or maybe a sub-tribe from them. So during the Khilafah Rashida, during the time of Umar, one of his um, one of his hamalats actually fought a battle against some of the Turks, and this is mentioned in Tarikh Ibn Kathir, the history of Ibn Kathir, and and when and the Muslims won that battle, and then Omar responded he, if I remember correctly, he was very upset by that because of this hadith of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and saying not to engage them again. And so the companions, the rest of their generation, pretty much left them alone. And then ultimately the companions during the time of Banu Umayyah, even though they expanded a bit more into the area of, like, for example, Uzbekistan and some of these areas, it was ultimately their major expansion was from Muhammad ibn Qasim, we know to be in Hind, and he was the first one to bring Islam to Pakistan. But so that was during the Khilafah Rashida. But what about the Abbasids? During the Abbasid time, when they were very, very strong, the last of the strong caliphs and the beginning of a new age of the Abbasid Empire was Caliph Mutawakkil. Caliph Mutawakkil, who was the Khalifa at the time of Imam Ahmad's death in 241 after Hijrah. And Mutawakkil was very famous for his kindness and love of Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal and the scholars of Islam at that time. And but al-Mutawakkil, he did something, and he one thing was that to avoid, I guess there's a lot of politics regarding his motive, but he wanted to have a special army, like a special armed forces, almost like to compare like a Revolutionary Guard, a special bodyguard army that was loyal to him personally. And this army was not going to be made of Arab. It was not going to be made of people from Persia. It had to be from people that had, a blank slate, clean hearts and clean minds. And so he chose the Turks. And so he made this Turkish army, and that was supposedly or supposed to be loyal to him. And then he also built a new capital and built a new city called Samarra, which was in Arabic, it was originally called Surra Man Ra'a, which means delighted is the one who sees it. Delighted is the one who sees this city. And subhanAllah, that city, I believe, is completely and totally abandoned today, no one living in it. In fact, the only thing that's there is the Grand Mosque of Samarra and its famous, super famous minaret, which is one of the most famous minarets in the world because of its spiral shape. Very, very beautiful, and it'd be lovely to see in Iraq. But so Al-Mutawakkil, he was ultimately killed by his own army and by the generals. The generals, they became greedy, and this ushered in a very, very horrible era for the Abbasids, and ultimately their weakness, the end of their strength, came because of this horrible political decision by of having this slave army. And this was the first time, I believe, that any Muslims used a slave army, but it would not be the last time. It would not be the last time. However, the Ottomans would be the last ones to do that, and and that's of course a different history. But Al-Mutawakkil and many of the Khulafa, the Khalifas afterwards, they were basically almost held as prisoners by the army, by the generals that vying for control of the Khalifa and forcing the Khalifa to make this order or that order. to favor them in this way and that way. And so they became greedy and politically motivated, and it made the Khalifa extremely weak for a period of about 100 years, for almost an entire century. And so the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, looking at his prophecy, because no one will take away what Allah is giving you except for Ben Qantura. This was the time, this 100-year time, when the Khalifa was basically a prisoner in his house, and there would be another time after that, which is the Benu, the Buwayhid time after the time of the Turkic soldiers, but and also the Seljuk era, but this era, this was when a lot of the now some of the different, we know that the Umayyad dynasty encompassed all of this area, but once the Abbasids took over, they started losing countries, the regions one at a time, and by the time of by this time, their authority and influence barely even extended beyond Iraq. And so the next and mix and great interaction with the Turks came at the hands of one field commander who lost a lot of battles, but eventually somehow riled himself up and started conquering relentlessly and enforcing scorched earth policies and just destroying everything in his wake, was a man named Genghis Khan. And so Genghis Khan ultimately he had a little bit of knowledge of history and a little bit of knowledge of Islam, and he had respect for the Muslims. He did not want to fight the Muslims whatsoever, and had the Muslims followed the advice of the Prophet ﷺ, leave the Turks alone as long as they leave you, then things would have been great. However, when Genghis Khan sent an emissary, an ambassador to one of the Muslim leaders killed the ambassador. We know that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, 1400 years ago, he said that "Lawla anna rusula la tuqtal laqataltukum." If it weren't for the fact that messengers, that ambassadors between nations are not to be killed or harmed, then I would have killed you too. He was talking to the two ambassadors of Musaylima the liar, we'll mention him soon enough, inshallah ta'ala. But this is a khuluq of Islam, to respect ambassadors and people who are influential when it comes to trade and negotiation, because that's the voice in between things. But subhanAllah, this is what the Muslim world had come to 600 years after the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Even just forgetting just basic dignity and just basic manners between nations. And so when the Muslim ruler, or when one of the Muslim rulers did this of the Khazak dynasty, when he did that, I think it was the Khazak dynasty or the Khazana dynasty, which was encompassing a huge area of land, a very huge area of land, almost the size of Iran. And in this whole area right here, after he killed the ambassador of Genghis Khan, and Genghis Khan thinking all I wanted was friendly relations with you, Genghis Khan brought his army and destroyed the entire Khana Khazanah, and it destroyed that entire dynasty, and raped and killed thousands or millions maybe. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. And then of course Genghis Khan passed away, and then his grandson Hulagu was the one who brought who completely ended the Abbasid Empire. And Hulagu also, likewise, at first did not want to attack the Muslims, but then because of some different events, egging him on, then he did, and the capital of the Abbasid Empire, Baghdad, was left wide open for him. He sieged the city and then just murdered every single one of its inhabitants, over 1 million people, within just a few short days, and also killed the Caliph, the Khalifa al-Mu'tasim. And that was the end of the Abbasid dynasty. So here the Prophet ﷺ says, leave the Turks alone as long as they leave you. If the Muslims had only followed that, then the rest of this statement of the Prophet ﷺ never would have had to worry about, because no one will take away what Allah is giving you except, them. Allah subhanahu wa Allah mustan, subhanAllah. That's now, quick question: what happened to the Turks afterwards? Nowadays, when we talk about Turks, we talk about our brothers and sisters in Islam. So I mean, they're not all bad, subhanallah. But mashallah, tabarakallah. What happened afterwards? So afterwards, Hulako and some of the other, Kublai Khan, for example. Kublai Khan was in China. Genghis Khan had conquered most of the known world at this time. Kublai Khan conquered China, believe it or not, and so one of the brothers accepted Islam, and then another one accepted Islam, and then they started. However, I mean, at first they accepted Buddhism, and then after that accepted Islam, and slowly, very, very slowly, Islam started to spread among them. Now, when they first accepted Islam, because they had pagan backgrounds, the rest of the people they followed, and they called themselves Muslims. But however, they accepted the religion, but they still continued to fight against the Muslims for a long time. And it would not be, another couple centuries, or at least another century or so, before they were truly Islamic in their Islam and felt some sense of brotherhood, even though there's lots of infighting, of course, between the Muslims until the day of resurrection. Allahu Mustan. Now, another event that happened at this time was the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and this actually happened just 2 years before. When was Baghdad sacked? When was Baghdad, the Abbasid Caliphate, destroyed? The year 656. 656 after Hijrah, or it was about 1250 something CE, but 656 after Hijrah. And I think it was during the month of Sha'ban, Allahu Mustan, if I remember correctly. But 2 years before that, a prophecy from the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ came true, and what's interesting is just how brilliant this prophecy was. Again, every single prophecy the Prophet ﷺ makes, every word has some great diqqah to it, and minuteness, and that just show how truly divinely inspired it was. And here the Prophet ﷺ said, لا تقوم الساعة حتى تخرج النار من أرض الحجاز تضيء أعناق الإبل ببصرة. So the day of resurrection, or the Sa'ah, the hour, would not come until a fire emerges from the land of the Hijaz, which is the land of Mecca, Medina here, this whole area. تضيء أعناق الإبل, illuminating the necks of camels, ببصرة. So a fire from the Hijaz illuminating the necks of camels, ببصرة, in Basra. Where is Basra? This is a city in Syria, so almost 1,000 miles away, or definitely 1,000 kilometers away. So we have Damascus. If you can see my pointer here, I can't in this mode with live, I can't turn on the laser thing here, but you can see Damascus there. Basra is just in the southwestern part of Syria, near, not too far from Damascus, just looking at this map. But we're talking about a fire that's erupting here, and yet is visible over here, a distance of a good 1,000 kilometers at least. maybe 1,000 miles, because I know going to Tabuk, for example, would be 900 kilometers, I think, from Medina. And this happened in 654 after Hijrah. So around the same time. And in 654, so basically it was a volcano eruption, and it happened in Medina. A volcano erupted in Medina. And, Medina is famous for its lava plains and lava fields. That, which is why which is why Medina is actually really incapable of expanding. The only way that you could expand the city of Medina is by destroying Mount Uhud, a huge, huge mountain range, or not a huge mountain range. It's not like the Rockies or the Appalachians or something like that going 1,000 miles, but the Uhud mountain range goes several miles, and Medina, the actual city of Medina, is kind of crunched in between the Uhud mountain range and also the lava plains, and so it can only expand in one direction. And really, if it expands, then you're chopping down date trees and stuff like that, and very important resources and stuff. And the Prophet ﷺ declared certain parts to be haram, and so expanding beyond those parts, there really isn't there's no sanctity for people beyond that. They really don't live in the haram, so there's not much virtue for that. But which may be why that Medina has not expanded too much. But however, so this happened in 654 after Hijrah. Imam Nawawi rahimahullah ta'ala, he happened to have witnessed, and he described how that this the light of it, and how people were really they believed that the day of resurrection was happening as this volcano was erupting in the city of Medina itself, subhanallah. And so that's something that happened. And during the Prophet's time, if geologists would have gone back in time 1400 years ago, if the Prophet ﷺ made that, if they heard that statement from the Prophet ﷺ, they would have said, all these volcanoes are extinct. These volcanoes are dormant. Nothing's going to happen here. You got to be nuts. So the Prophet ﷺ making that prophecy and it coming to light exactly as it did, subhanAllah, is just really, really amazing. And that it would cast a light that extended over 1,000 miles, subhanAllah. Now, the very last prophecy that I want to talk about, inshallah ta'ala, and then next week we'll go into social trends, and then we'll have to continue during Ramadan, inshallah ta'ala. But so the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, and this is really amazing as well. He said, لَتُفْتَحَنَّ الْقِسْطَنْطِينِيَّةَ, or that Constantinople will certainly be open, be conquered. Fath will be conquered and liberated by the Muslims. فَلَنِعْمَ الْأَمِيرِ أَمِيرُهَا وَلَنِعْمَ الْجَيْشُ ذَلِكَ الْجَيْشِ. And what a great Amir or leader, commander, their commander is, and what a great army their army is, or what a blessed and virtuous Amir and army. So the Prophet ﷺ, he made that prophecy, and there's lots of different prophecies about Constantinople. And at one time he also said that the first army of my ummah, that أول جيش يغزو قسطنطينية مغفور لهم, that the first army that tries to conquer Constantinople will be forgiven. And that happened during the time of Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan. He commissioned an army, and at the head of it was his son Yazid. And of course there were some Sahaba of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ in that army. And among them was Abu Ayyub al-Ansari, Khalid ibn Zayd, Abu Ayyub al-Ansari, one of the distant cousins of the Prophet ﷺ from the Prophet's mother's side. The man who the Prophet ﷺ actually lived in his home for several months when the Prophet ﷺ first made the hijrah. And so Abu Ayyub al-Ansari lived to see this battle against Constantinople, and he passed away. And when right on his deathbed during the battle, and there are several different stories of a couple different stories of him in the battle, but he told Yazid to have his body buried underneath its walls or as far ahead as they can get. And that's something that really something amazing. And when we think about that mawqif that stands from Abu Ayyub al-Ansari, he wanted to be buried in the land of the enemy, that knowing that ultimately that the Muslims would conquer that land, but subhanAllah, that would not happen for another 900 years or another 800 years. And one thing about us as Muslims, when it comes to burial, a lot of times we don't like to, or not a lot of times, but generally we abstain from burying ourselves. We are burying our dead in graveyards or in areas where we are not, it's not Muslims together. We want to be united with all of our, just as we are united in our prayer lines, we want to be united in burial as well. And so this is a very fascinating mawqif from Abu Ayyub al-Ansari. He didn't say, bury me with the rest of the dead of the Muslims. He said, bury me as far ahead as you can in the land of the enemy. Let my grave be a sore spot for them, However, ultimately, there are some narrations or some stories and local legends that say that his grave ultimately became a place of pilgrimage for the Christians there. That this is, a companion of the Prophet of Arabia, for example. And Allah knows best. But also from Banu Umayyah, the Umayyads, Sulaiman ibn Abdul Malik, his very, very short reign as Khalifa was characterized by one big, long, overextended fight against Constantinople. And Sulaiman ibn Abdul Malik wanted to be this emir that the Prophet ﷺ talked about here. And so he wanted to make that prophecy true, and for him, but because of how far deep he had to make the supply line extended, and even the supply line is going through, lands that are predominantly Christians. So he has to make deals with them along the way, and it just became a huge big mess. And then he died during all of that, and so then his successor Umar ibn Abdul Aziz immediately put a stop to that. But however, this honor would go to someone else. A man known as Mehmet II, the son of Murat. This was a young man from the Banu Uthman, the children of the descendants of Uthman, the founder of the Ottoman Empire. Uthman, of course, is the son of Ertugrul, the subject of the famous television show that from the Turkish television show, which now is on Netflix, Ertugrul, and Ertugrul, and so Mehmet II, one thing that he was 19 years old when he was first given the crown, and became the Khalifa, or became the Sultan, and this was the year 1451. And so, and he was previously Sultan for, very, very short time, years earlier, because his father, the Sultan, abdicated the throne. His father was someone who loved worship, was very much into Sufism and ibadah and worship, and so he just did not like the worldly life at all, and he said, I don't want anything. I'm really good at this, but hey, I would much rather be worshiping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so that's exactly what he did. But then when Mehmet II wasn't really able to wield the empire very well, or very strongly, and foster confidence in his in everyone else, because he was only about 12 years old at the time. Then they brought Murat back, and then and when he finally passed away, then Mehmet II became the sultan for good, and he was only 19 years old. But what happened in those few short years when he was preparing again, he became a completely different person, subhanAllah, rather than the and so one thing that the Constantine, the emperor and the patriarch of Constantinople, he said, you know what, I have a relative of yours who also has claimed to be the throne, and if you don't send me a bunch of money, I'm going to release him. And you know what he'll do. He'll drum up a bunch of support, claim that he's the legitimate ruler and not you. And so just give me a tons and tons and tons and tons of money, and I won't release this guy. I'll just keep him in my dungeons somewhere, or surrounded by a bunch of concubines, and just playing with the dunya and whatever. And so Mehmet II, at this moment, he said, just do what you want. I don't care. And when he responded like that, he wasn't, cowering in fear, sending them money. Then Constantine realized, okay, I'm dealing with a completely different person than I was dealing with 5 years ago. This man has changed. So Constantine he made and Sultan Mehmet II, they made year-long preparations. They spent each side is spending a year preparing for battle. He realized that the writings are on the wall, and that Mehmet II wants Constantinople and wants to conquer it. And the amazing thing is that Constantinople, the walls of Constantinople were so famous, and it was considered an unconquerable city because of how huge and how thick and how numerous its walls were, its city walls. And so with this, and in anticipation of this, and the only way that the Muslims were able to conquer this city were until they were not able to conquer it until almost even decades and decades after. Not only had they conquered the rest of Anatolia, but also even conquered over 100 miles into the European part of southeast Europe, to completely cut off. So Constantinople was just a city and a kingdom by itself, just an empire that had been reduced to just a single city. And it stayed that way for decades, and because of the the Ottomans. However, but because it was so strong, it was considered impregnable and untouchable. But we had that prophecy. And Sultan Mehmed II, his murabbi, his teacher, was a great and well-known sheikh who instilled within him that you are going to be that emir. And there are lots of lessons of tarbiyah. Then there's lots of different writings about him and about their relationship. But subhanallah, and so without going into too much detail, one of the things is that in Constantinople, they were compiling food and grain, and trying to make allegiances with a lot of their neighbors to secure help for when that battle would come. And also they had a very, very huge chain across the channel to prevent ships from coming in and attacking it. And so the battle ultimately started in Rabi' al-Awwal of 857. That was in April 1453. And so the Ottoman soldiers were here, and this is the Netflix actually just released a documentary about this battle called, I think it's called Rise of Empires. And you see here the ships of the Muslims, the Ottomans, and then here's this chain right here on the map. That's if a ship tries to go across, the chain will just cut it into pieces. And however, what did he do? So he decided to relocate the navy to the other side. And how did he do that? He, during the night, they chopped down a bunch of trees, get some oil, fat, and And basically they built a road and made it very oily, and then they pulled these ships, dozens and dozens of ships over the land, and made a land bridge for the ships during the middle of the night, during this month-long siege, this month-long battle. And that's so that once the Byzantines wake up the next day, they see the ships of the Ottomans are right in their channel, right in the middle of, or practically in the middle of the city. And then they realize that their doom is impending. And so just very, very shortly after that, the city walls came down ultimately after enough fighting, and the conquest happened on May 29th, 1453, one of the greatest victories in the history of Islam, and it's the subject of a lot of documentaries, and it really became the changing of an era. The medieval times basically ended. The Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, the medieval era ended for Europe at that moment, and what is known as the Enlightenment and the Renaissance age began for the Europeans with that moment, because the church, the Eastern Church, even though they didn't have tons and tons of influence, the influence of the church waned, and the spread of Islamic ideals and Islamic values became much more prevalent, and of course Islamic science and that sort of thing. And so that is what really became one of the great battles that changed human history as we know it. So inshallah ta'ala, with next week we will continue inshallah with and talking about more signs of the hour, and especially begin talking about some of the social trends that the Prophet ﷺ prophesied that would happen. How would Islam change before the day of resurrection? How would society and people change? And some different things that the Prophet ﷺ saw, and then ultimately going into the major signs of the day of resurrection, insha'Allah ta'ala. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. بارك الله فيكم.